For 5 years, Sarah was the only one who visited Grandma Beatrice, listened to her stories, and cared when everyone else only wanted money. Yet when the will was read, Sarah's name was missing. Her family mocked her, calling her poor, useless, and unworthy of the fortune. But Beatrice had been watching everything. Every cold phone call, every fake emergency, every dollar begged for and never thanked. And inside one locked ledger was the truth. Sarah was not forgotten. She was the only one Beatrice trusted with the real inheritance.
I am Sarah Vance, 30 last Tuesday. I sat in a frigid Salem law office, watching my aunt smirk as Grandma's will was read. My cousins snatched the cash, the land, and the jewelry. My aunt grabbed the lakeside estate. Jade took the offshore accounts, while Liam kept the stocks. I was the only one who visited Grandma for years, yet my name never came up. My aunt sneered at my worn jacket, claiming I got what I deserved. But she missed the second envelope in the lawyer S bag. And what that package held cost my family every cent they thought they won. Before I reveal the secret, welcome to Legacy Lies. Subscribe if you believe in loyalty. Drop a comment with your age and state. Now, back to that desk, and the moment my aunt tried to erase me, the clock ticked a slow, steady pulse. Outside, an autumn storm turned the river into a grey blur. The office smelled of stale coffee and dusty paper, mister. Henderson sat at the head of the table, turning a heavy page. To my daughter Brenda, he read, cold, flat. I leave the primary Bend estate, the house and all acreage. Brenda exhaled, her nails tapping nervously against the oak, finally stilled. She smoothed her cashmere sweater. As a vintage clothing expert, I noticed the stiff synthetic drape. It was fake, just like her, to my granddaughter Jade. Henderson continued, I leave the liquid offshore accounts. Jade didn't look up from her phone, just checked her lighter mind. Liam, he added. I watched my brother shift. He refused to meet my eyes, staring at a brass weight on the desk. I leave the domestic stocks and the commercial real estate shares. Henderson finished. Liam swallowed hard and nodded. The file thudded shut. My name was never spoken. I sat in silence, listening to the clock. I felt no sting of rejection, only a cold, sharp clarity. Beatrice, my grandmother, had raised me. She didn't make oversights, she made plans. Brenda broke the silence with a sigh of fake pity. I know this is tough, she said, her voice dripping with sugar. But Mother was a pragmatist. You chose a hobby over a career. She knew you couldn't handle capital. It is for the best. Liam flinched, staying quiet. Jade offered a thin, rehearsed smile. We will send you some knickknacks, Brenda added, rising to claim her victory. A vase or an old quilt for your collection. She reached for her coat. Sit down, Brenda. Henderson's voice was soft, yet it sucked the air from the room. Brenda froze, hand hovering near her collar. Henderson withdrew a thick, weathered envelope from his briefcase. The red wax seal bore Grandma S.'s personal crest. The main will is concluded, Henderson said, finally locking eyes with me. However, I was told to wait until the primary gifts were accepted. He broke the wax seal. The snap echoed louder than the clock. There is a second document. He held the envelope high. The mood shifted from triumphant to fragile. Brenda lowered her arm. Her synthetic sweater looked cheap. Henderson sliced the paper. The sharp tear made Liam flinch. He placed 2 items on the table with deliberate care. First, a heavy tarnished brass key. It bore a deep dark patina, the grooves worn smooth. Second, a thick worn leather ledger bound by a small brass lock. Henderson didn't smile. He looked at us like a surgeon delivering a grim diagnosis. This is not an addition to the estate, he stated, tapping the ledger. This is a separate, binding contract. Beatrice established a blind trust independent of the court. Access is tied to this key. Brenda laughed, a sharp, breathless sound. A blind trust? Mother hated trusts. What is in it? Henderson ignored her. He looked only at me. Sarah, your grandmother outlined a specific residency clause. To inherit what this key secures, you must live in the weaver's cottage on the edge of the Bend property. You must live there alone for 30 days. No outside financial help. If you leave for even one night, the contract is void and the trust dissolves. Brenda laughed harder. Jade looked up, confused. Liam kept his eyes down, a muscle pulsing in his jaw. The weaver's cottage. Brenda sneered, her confidence returning. That miserable shack in the woods. the drafty floorboards and the ancient hearth. "Sarah, Mother isn't giving you an inheritance. She is giving you a chore, a punishment for playing with rags." Jade smirked, sliding her phone away. 30 days without heat. Have fun freezing to death, cousin." I stayed silent. I kept my eyes on the table, resting my fingertips against the ledger. The leather felt brittle as I traced the binding. A faint scent rose peppermint oil and old paper. It was Grandma. It was the exact smell of her study, where she taught me to authenticate historical documents. My heart thumped. This wasn't punishment. Beatrice never acted out of spite. She acted out of strategy. The cottage was isolated. She was removing me from the family noise, giving me a place to focus. She was giving me an assignment. I looked at Henderson. "I accept the terms." He nodded, pushing the key and ledger toward me. The 30-day clock starts at sundown. I dropped the items into my tote and walked out. The cold air hit like ice. The storm intensified, blanketing the streets in white. I climbed into my Subaru. The engine rattled before starting. I cranked the heat, but it only blew lukewarm air against the frozen windshield. The drive to Bend took over an hour in the mounting snow. The roads wound through dense, bare forests. The wipers served as a metronome for my racing thoughts. I pictured Grandma in her study, sipping tea, calculating this exact scenario. Beatrice didn't build a legacy by leaving things to chance. If she left a locked ledger, it held answers. If she demanded I stay in the cottage, she knew those walls provided something the main house could not: protection, secrecy. I knew the cottage well. It was an 18th century relic, a rare survivor from the original land claim that predated our family in Oregon. Grandma spent a fortune preserving its structure, refusing to modernize it. No central heat, no hot water, and a roof pitched to shed heavy snow. But it had a stone hearth, spring water, and shelves of oil lamps. Because of my work, I spent my days analyzing colonial textiles. I understood the reality of historical living. I was ready. I knew how those cottage owners survived brutal winters. I could manage, but turning onto the private lane, my gut twisted. The snow was untouched, a perfect sheet of white. My tires spun wild before the all-wheel drive grabbed hold. I crested the hill and saw the cottage outline. Then I jammed the brakes, the car fishtailed, anti-lock brakes grinding against ice. I slid to a stop inches from a polished metal wall parked sideways. Blocking the path was a pristine black Civ Cynthia's car. She hadn't gone to the office. She sent it. Here. The Civ was wedged between two oaks. A total barrier. No way around. The banks dropped into a ravine. I left the engine running and stepped into the bitter wind. The cold stung my skin. I trudged through knee-deep snow to the barrier, wiping frost from the window. I peered inside. Empty. The keys were gone. Cynthia had trapped me long before Julian opened that envelope. She knew the trust conditions, or she guessed Beatrice's final move. By blocking the road, she was forcing a legal default. If I couldn't reach the property line by sunset, or if I left to get a tow, the 30-day clause would void the contract. I stood in the swirling white. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows. Less than an hour left. Cynthia thought, a locked car and a freezing mountain would break me. She thought, I was just the quiet niece who sold old blankets. My fingers gripped the brass key in my pocket. I killed the ignition. The Subaru went silent, leaving only the wind howling through the pines. Cynthia thought her luxury vehicle was an impenetrable fortress. She figured I would sit there, watch the gas gauge fall, and crawl back to town. She didn't know my stubborn streak. I slung my bag over my shoulder, pulled my collar tight, and stepped into the drifts. My boots crunched into the frozen crust. The temperature dropped as the sun vanished. Pine branches snapped under the ice. My lungs burned, but I kept my eyes on the path. 20 minutes of grueling climbing. Later, the dark silhouette of the cottage finally appeared. Built 3 centuries ago, this place was a fortress, sloped roofs, tiny windows, and weathered shingles. I stepped onto the porch, stomping ice off my boots. My numb fingers found the rusted iron key hidden under a floorboard. The deadbolt groaned, but the door swung open. I hit the light switch. Nothing. I flipped it again. Total darkness. No power. Panicked, I tightened my chest. I rushed outside to check the meter. The conduit pipe was hanging loose. The rubber was sliced cleanly, exposing the copper. A yellow tag flapped in the wind, a local contractor logo. It read Winterization Disconnect, authorized by Cynthia Hall. She hadn't just blocked the road, she had weaponized the Vermont winter. She knew the contract barred outside help. Calling an electrician on a holiday weekend would be a fortune and break my terms. She wanted me frozen out by midnight. I went back inside, locking the door against the storm, pitch black. I felt my way along the walls until I hit the cold stone hearth. I grabbed the lantern and matches. I struck one, the sulphur flare burning bright. The flame bloomed, steady and orange. I lit the wick and golden light flooded the room, driving back the shadows. It hit the floor, revealing the antique loom, a massive, beautiful oak machine. It stood tall, a silent witness to the past. My pulse slowed. I was an appraiser. I knew how to handle historical artifacts. Now I just had to live in one, but the hearth was empty. The kindling bin was just dust. Cynthia had cleared out the firewood. The house was an icebox, without a fire. I wouldn't last until morning. I wondered if I should start burning floorboards. Then a low rumble shook the ground. Not whined, a diesel engine. I wiped the window. Headlights sliced through the blizzard. A heavy truck ploughed straight over the snowbanks, ignoring the roadblock. It idled near the porch. The door swung open and a woman stepped into the gale. Maya? My brother Ethan's wife. She was a brilliant architect from Boston who specialized in load-bearing frameworks. She had a mind for finding structural weaknesses. She had always hated my Aunt Cynthia's fake, leveraged lifestyle. I threw the door open wide. Maya trudged up the stairs, carrying thermal blankets. "You are freezing," she said, pushing past me. "What are you doing here?" I asked, shutting out the wind. "Ethan told you to stay out of this." She dropped the blankets. "Ethan says a lot of things," she scoffed. "He said Cynthia was being practical with that roadblock. I know this storm, and I know your aunt. She doesn't play fair." She returned to her truck, hauling in 2 bags of birch and cedar. She dumped them on the hearth. "He forbade you from helping," I said, watching her stack the wood with precision. "If Cynthia finds out, she will punish him." Maya struck a match and tossed it in. The cedar caught, instantly sending heat into the room. She brushed off her gloves. Her eyes were steady. "Ethan lets fear dictate his loyalty," she said softly. "Blood makes you related, but showing up when the power lines are cut, that makes you family. Cynthia thinks she can bully you out of this inheritance. I am not letting her win on a technicality." Maya's courage was a sharp contrast to my brother's cowardice. She was risking her marriage for me. "I cannot pay you for this wood," I warned. "The contract forbids financial help." "Think of this as a housewarming gift," Maya said, zipping her coat. "I have to leave. If I stay, they will claim you were not alone. Keep the fire stoked. Lock the doors." I watched from the window as her truck carved a path through the snow, her taillights vanishing into the whiteout. The cabin was alive now. The hearth roared, soaking the thick stones with heat. The warmth seeped into my frozen limbs. I walked to the table, shed my coat, and sat down. From my bag, I pulled the heavy leather ledger and the brass key. Firelight danced over the cracked cover as the material warmed. A sharp scent of peppermint oil filled the room. I slid the key into the small padlock. The mechanism shifted with a heavy, satisfying click. It popped open. I lifted the cover, expecting a standard diary or maybe a letter about the will. Perhaps some final words or a half-hearted apology. What I found stole the air from my lungs. The parchment was not filled with personal musings. It was ruled into precise columns of dates, names, interest rates, and massive dollar amounts. Beside these figures, written in her signature slanted cursive, were meticulous notes in striking red ink. It was a secret ledger, a master record of every hidden transaction, every favor leveraged, and every broken promise. As I traced the red ink, the truth hit me. My grandmother had not left me an empty inheritance. She had handed me a loaded weapon. Birch logs hissed in the hearth, spitting embers against the brick. I sat at the table, the lanterns casting a golden glow over the open pages. The room smelled of smoke, melting frost, and the biting, medicinal tang of peppermint rising from the old paper. I ran my finger down the first column. Grandmother had handwriting from a lost era. Her cursive was perfect, mathematical, and written in a stark black ink that cut through the page. As an appraiser, I spent my career authenticating history. I knew how to look at evidence to spot a fake. My family, I quickly saw, was a collection of frauds. Grandmother was not just some lonely widow tending to her roses. She was the secret bankroll for every relative who had sneered at me in the boardroom. I turned the page. The header reads, Cynthia Hall, Luxury Imports. My aunt had spent a decade building an image as a self-made titan. She gave keynote speeches and bragged about her business genius. The ledger told a very different story. Cynthia had not built an empire. She had built a house of cards on her mother's dime. Line after line showed massive wire transfers, $50,000 for payroll, $100,000 for a storefront lease. But it was the margins that floored me. She had kept a moral accounting too. My finger stopped at the bottom, where the black ink turned into harsh, unforgiving red. I read the note aloud, my voice ringing in the dark. April 14th. Wired $200,000 to save Cynthia's margins. Asked her to stay for tea. She claimed her driver was waiting. The tea went cold. 8% interest applied. It hit me hard. I stared at the red ink until the letters blurred. I remembered that day. I remembered pulling into the estate and seeing Cynthia SUV speeding away. I remembered walking in to find Grandmother sitting alone at the island, staring at 2 cold, untouched cups of tea. The weight of the ledger felt like the ground shifting under me. This was not just financial ruin, it was an itemized receipt of an old woman's profound loneliness. Cynthia took the cash to save her vanity project, then could not spare 15 minutes for the mother who saved her. Grandmother had penalized her for the cruelty, quietly adding interest to the debt of a broken heart. I flipped the page. Ethan. My brother played the part of the savvy developer, driving sports cars and wearing tailored suits. According to the ledger, his last 3 property flips were entirely funded by Grandmother. When a contractor walked off, she paid the settlement. When a foundation cracked and the bank threatened foreclosure, she wired the bailout. Then there was Chloe, my cousin. She posed as a global influencer, posting photos from Dubai and Paris. The ledger showed those trips were not sponsored by brands. They were funded by emergency cash requests sent to her grandmother. I found a $20,000 transfer for a yacht in the Mediterranean. The red ink simply noted that Chloe called in tears about her image. I paid the captain, did not receive a thank you note. They were parasites. They drained her wealth for their own vanity, then mocked me for my work. Grandmother had watched it all happen. She kept the receipts, locked them away, and handed me the key. She gave me the sword to cut through their lies. My phone buzzed, shattering the silence. It rattled on the table, the screen casting a harsh blue glow. Cynthia's name flashed. I checked the time past midnight. Outside, the storm was still throwing ice against the windows. I swiped the screen. "I didn't say a word, Megan," Cynthia said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "I am so glad you have a signal. I have been worrying about you." I watched the firelight hit the red ink. "Did you hire someone to cut the power lines?" I asked. Cynthia let out a dismissive sigh. That was scheduled maintenance. "Listen, sweetheart, I know you want to prove a point, but the temperature is dropping. That shack is an icebox. You will get 6 playing pioneer. I am perfectly warm," I replied, my voice steady. Cynthia ignored me. "I want to help, Megan. I will write you a personal check for $10,000. Pack your bags, come down the mountains and stay at the lodge. You can start a little shop. You do not need to suffer for some blind trust that probably only has a few old bonds." She was fishing, testing me to see if I opened the ledger, if I had the power. I locked the cover. The metal click echoed. "I do not need your money, Cynthia. I am staying the month." The fake warmth vanished. Her voice turned jagged. "You arrogant, ungrateful girl," she snapped. "You think you are better than us. I was trying to be generous to my sister's child. You were trying to buy a default," I corrected. Cynthia gasped. "You want war? Fine. That cottage is not up to code. No heat, no plumbing. I will call a judge at dawn. I am having the property condemned. The sheriff will drag you off that mountain by noon. Enjoy your last night in the cold, Megan. The line went dead. I set the phone down. The war started. Cynthia thought this was just a property battle. She had no idea I was sitting in the dark, armed with the evidence to burn her world down. I added a log to the fire and waited for the sun. Day 5 arrived bitter and clear. Cynthia never sent the sheriff. Offices were slow during the winter holiday. She realized the legal route was too sluggish. They wanted me broken now. If they could not freeze me out, they would starve me out. The target shifted from Cynthia to my cousin. Chloe began her campaign from a Boston penthouse. It started Tuesday. My phone buzzed on the table. Then chaos. A storm of alerts flooded my screen. I opened my inbox. My clients, curators, and top textile collectors were turning on me. Subject lines read like obituaries for my career. Cancellations, questions. The Boston Historical Society dropped me. Their director cited reports online that questioned my professional integrity. I checked my business profile. My 5-star rating had tanked. Dozens of anonymous trolls posted brutal reviews, they claimed. I faked colonial fabrics, took kickbacks, and scammed folks out of heirlooms. Chloe owned a digital empire, millions of followers, and bot networks designed to manipulate algorithms. She turned her entire machine against me just to ruin my life. In the vintage textile world, reputation is everything. One fraud rumor is a death sentence. Chloe was flooding the market with lies. My phone chimed again. Another cancellation. I stood in the cottage shivering, trying to stop the panic. If the business died, I would be broke when I left this mountain. They wanted me to abandon the residency to save my firm. I put the phone face down. I refused to let Chloe win. I needed something real. My eyes landed on a quilt. Beatrice had hung a mid-19th century tramp-to-piece. It was a complex style where stitches outline patterns, stuffed with yarns, to make them pop, a feather, wreath design with an indigo. Bored, I walked over, tracing the raised feathers. Usually the texture calmed me, but as I ran my hand along the edge, my eyes caught something wrong. The quilt front was a genuine antique. The cotton worn soft, but the backing felt stiff. I stepped closer, tilting the lamp. The thread holding the layers together had a strange, artificial sheen. I squinted at the tiny loops. Authentic 19th century quilts use cotton or linen thread. This caught the light with a synthetic glare. It was nylon. Nylon did not exist back then. Also, the stitching was too perfect, clearly done by a machine. Beatrice was a total purist. She would never allow a cheap modern fix on a museum piece unless it served his hidden purpose. I grabbed my appraisal kit and pulled out a seam ripper. I returned to the quilt and slid the blade under that synthetic thread. With one precise motion, I snapped the nylon. I worked along the edge, separating the antique front from the modern backing. As the seam popped, a corner of pale yellow paper peeked out. I gasped. This place was a fortress. Beatrice had turned her home into a vault. I reached into the hollow quilt and pulled out a thick manila folder. I opened it under the lamp. The papers had nothing to do with antiques. It was a stack of legal agreements and settlement files. The first one was a cease and desist from a Brooklyn jewelry designer accusing Chloe Hall lifestyle brands of theft. The designer claimed Chloe ripped off her necklace designs, mass-produced them, and sold them as her own. Attached was a $50,000 settlement check signed by Beatrice. I kept digging. There were 6 settlements. Chloe's entire brand was built on lies. She was a serial plagiarist who stole from artists and used her grandmother to pay them off. Every agreement was countersigned by Beatrice, with angry red notes. Chloe begged for another bailout. Beatrice wrote before she died. She threatened to cut me off if I did not pay the artist. The note said she is a hollow girl, living a hollow life. Chloe was attacking me. Not knowing, I held the proof of her fraud. If these leaked, her brand would be finished. A lawsuit would destroy her. My phone buzzed Maya. I picked up Megan, she said, her voice crackling. Have you seen your page? I am watching the reviews, I said, keeping my voice steady. Maya took a breath. I knew Cynthia could not pull this off, so I called a favor. My firm's head owes me. I had him trace the IP addresses hitting your page. What did he find? I asked. Already guessing. They are using proxies, Maya said. He traced the traffic back to a luxury condo in Boston Close building. Exactly. Maya confirmed she hired a firm to nuke your reputation. I have the logs linking the attack to her private network. I can send the file. Send it, I said. Thank you. Do not thank me yet, she warned. This is just the start. Ethan and Cynthia are planning something too. Stay alert. I will, I promised. I hung up, and the file download finished. I had the digital trail linking Chloe to the smear campaign and the paper trail proving she was a fraud. I grabbed the leather ledger, unlocked the padlock, and turned to the section on Chloe's offshore accounts. I picked up my pen under Beatrice's red notes. I added my own in black ink. I wrote down the date and the endas found in the quilt. The ledger was not just history anymore. It was a weapon. Chloe had fired her best shot. She did not realize her own house was covered in gasoline, and I was holding the match. The attack was neutralized by the secrets hidden in these walls. I spent days in a routine, ignoring the threats, waiting. Then on the 11th morning, the wind died, and a heavy silence fell. The snow stopped. I was by the hearth when I heard a distinct crunch on the porch, a heavy boot on frozen wood. Someone had made it up the road, and they were standing outside my door. The mountain went quiet after the smear campaign collapsed. The fake reviews stayed up, but the frantic digital assault faded into the winter chill. Chloe retreated, knowing her own corporate theft was one leak away from ruin. The silence felt like the calm before a tsunami. They were just changing tactics. The second week was all about my brother Silas. He played the perfect peacemaker at family events. He wore Italian suits, drove an expensive car, and ordered top-shelf scotch like a mogul. But his entire success was a lie, a facade built entirely on Grandma's checkbook. Without her cash to cover his failed deals, Silas was broke and desperate men make dangerous moves. By day 15, I was deep into a brutal routine. Living in that cabin meant constant work. Every morning I was outside, swinging a heavy iron maul against frozen logs to keep the fires burning. The rhythm kept me warm and focused. I actually left the door unlocked while I worked, trusting the remote location to keep strangers away. A bad mistake. After hauling wood inside, I tended the hearth. Once the cedar logs caught, I started checking the wide pine floorboards for loose spots. Grandma had layered the floors with heavy vintage rugs to block the drafts. One piece in the center of the room looked off. It was a mid-19th century hand-woven tapestry, dyed with deep indigo and vibrant madder roots. I knelt there, running my fingers over the complex geometric patterns. Something felt loose underneath. The floor dipped when I pressed down. I rolled back the heavy rug, revealing the raw timber. One board did not have the standard hand-forged nails like the others. I grabbed a screwdriver from my kit and jammed it into the seam. With one sharp twist, the plank popped right out. I pried up a floorboard and found a black leather portfolio. Inside, no ledger, but a record of my brother Julian's private demons. Pages filled with offshore wire transfers to the Caymans and brutal notices from betting rings. He had burned through hundreds of thousands. Grandma had paid his debts twice, leaving notes in the margins about his utter lack of discipline. His debt was mounting and the syndicates were closing in. That explained why he took his inheritance without a fight. He needed to sell the estate fast to pay his creditors. While I was digging through his ruin by the fire, a real nightmare began outside. He had parked his sedan half a mile away, hiking through the snow, frantic and cornered, thinking I was still at the woodpile. He crept onto the porch, clutching a steel pry bar. He eyed the eastern window, planning to force it and steal the ledger. He made a huge mistake underestimating the women in this family. Maya had driven up to drop off groceries. She spotted his tracks and followed. As he jammed the bar under the frame, he shifted his weight, and a rotted piece of trim snapped under his boot. The crack sounded like a gunshot. Julian froze, turning slowly. Maya stood at the base of the steps with a grocery bag, staring at him with cold disgust. A grown man, shivering in the snow, trying to break into his own grandmother's home. Maya spoke with a quiet, icy precision. She told him to drop the tool. He stammered, offering some pathetic lie about checking for drafts. Maya dropped her bag. She called his name, her voice hard as stone. She knew exactly why he was here, drowning in debt and trying to rob his own sister. I walked to the window. I watched him drop the bar. It thudded into the snow and vanished. His facade of success simply collapsed. Maya didn't even look at him as she stepped past to knock on my door. Julian lingered for a minute before retreating, leaving a trail of shameful footprints. Maya came in, shaking not from the cold, but from the realization her marriage was a total lie. I handed her the portfolio. She scanned the offshore receipts and threats. The man she married was a ghost. He wasn't a businessman, he was a parasite willing to destroy family just to save his skin. Maya stared into the flames with new dangerous resolve. She whispered that he would call the estate lawyers the second he hit his car. Desperate men make reckless deals. If he couldn't steal the ledger, he would try to seize the land by force. We had to call my lawyer, Julian. I locked the heavy oak door just as the sun climbed over the ridge. The storm left the mountain under a blinding, icy glaze. I steered my car down the treacherous road, crunching over Julian's frozen tracks. 20 miles out, I pulled into a diner near an old logging route, a place smelling of burnt coffee and grease, perfect for a secret meeting. Julian Pierce waited in a back booth, his charcoal suit looking sharp against the worn red vinyl. He was a tactician. Grandma hired him years ago for his ruthless approach to asset protection. He treated law like a scalpel. He skipped the small talk as I slid into the booth. He folded his hands over his briefcase. He asked if I had survived the 2 weeks. I told him about the smear campaign and the break-in attempt, keeping my voice low. He just nodded. Desperation always leads to bad choices. I placed the heavy, tarnished brass key on the table. I told him I had read the ledger and found the hidden caches. My siblings were drowning in syndicate debt, and Grandma had funded their entire lives. Julian picked up the key, turning it over. He corrected me. She funded their illusions. She never gave away a cent without securing her investment first. He clicked his briefcase open. He pulled out thick legal folders. That key, he explained, opens a vault at a regional bank in Burlington. As executor, I was authorized to pull these files once. I had the ledger. He flattened his hand on the top folder. The items under the floor were emotional, but these were the corporate facts. He slid a document over. The paper hissed as it skidded across the tabletop. I checked the header, Granite Holdings. Julian's voice dropped. Your grandmother set up this trust 20 years ago. She didn't run a charity. When Cynthia wanted capital for her brand, Beatrice forced her to sign a pledge. When Julian needed bailouts, Beatrice filed financing statements against his companies. I stared at the dense legal jargon, the reality finally setting in. I knew fabrics, but now I was reading corporate law. A financing statement is a public lien. It puts creditors first. If a debtor defaults, they aren't unsecured loans, I whispered. Exactly, Julian said. Beatrice secured every penny. She holds the liens on Cynthia's inventory, the equity in their condos, and the voting rights in Julian-S properties. He leaned in as the new trustee. You don't just own their debt, you own their collateral. The diner noise faded away. I sat there, stunned by the weight of it. I wasn't just a niece fighting for a cottage. I was the majority stakeholder in their entire lives. Beatrice had built a hostile takeover and put me in charge. If you execute these, Julian noted, you can seize Cynthia's company. You can freeze accounts. You can liquidate assets. You can foreclose on their entire lifestyles. You hold the nuclear codes to the family empire. I touched the paper. The power dizzying, adrenaline surged. As I thought of their past insults, I wanted to drive back and evict them right now. Julian noticed my posture. He pressed his hand over the documents and pulled them back. Not yet, he warned. Why not? I challenged. I have the proof. The trust is conditional, Julian stated. Granite Holdings stays dormant until that 30-day residency clause is met. If you reveal these agreements now, Cynthia will file an emergency injunction and tie you up in court for years. He snapped his briefcase shut. If you fail to finish those 15 days, the trust dissolves and assets go to charity. My siblings would walk away free. You would lose everything. The trap snapped shut. I had to go back to that freezing cabin. They won't stop, I said, staring at the snow. Julian nodded grimly. You are right. Your brother was a nuisance, but Cynthia is a different threat. She plays for keeps, and she will escalate. She will move from petty games to real force. She might use the law or guards to drag you off that land. He stood up. Go back, Megan. Keep the fire burning. Stay locked in. Don't reveal the blade until it is at their throats. I watched Julian head out into the freezing air. I pocketed the key, feeling the weight of impending ruin. I drove back up the mountains. The silence felt like a threat. It felt like a held breath. Cynthia thought she was fighting a peasant for a piece of land. I braced for the hit while hiding out in my mountain cabin, but 50 miles away, the family's ruin was already detonating. It all started in the kitchen of Ethan and Maya's condo. Maya arrived late, coats still on. She strode to the kitchen island and dumped the black folder I had found onto the marble. Ethan, drink in hand, looked up from real estate listings, expecting comfort. Instead, he saw wire receipts and collection notices. He went pale. His facade of a successful developer crumbled. He tried to spin a lie, but the words failed him. How much? Maya asked, her voice deadly calm. Ethan swallowed. 400,000, he whispered. It grows weekly. The sports books want cash now. Maya just stood there, watching her world collapse. You tried to rob your own sister to save your skin. You trashed Grandma's place while she lived there. Ethan pleaded, but she pulled away. Cynthia has a plan, he said. A developer wants the estate for a luxury resort. $12 million, closing in 7 days. Maya shook her head. The estate is in probate, no clear title, no sale. Ethan insisted. Cynthia claimed she held the deed. If Megan stays, the deal dies. Cynthia wants her gone this week. How? Maya demanded. Ethan stared at his drink. She is hiring private security to evict her tonight. The kitchen went dead silent. Ethan waited for his wife to defend him. She didn't. Maya ripped off her rings. I married an ambitious man, not a coward. Ethan panicked as she dropped the platinum bands. They hit the marble with a sharp, final metallic ring. I am filing for divorce in the morning. Maya didn't flinch. Don't contact my office. She walked it out, driving through the freezing night toward the estate. She reached my cottage just before midnight. I threw the bolt, shocked by her arrival. They are coming tonight, she gasped, slamming the heavy iron lock shut. Ethan confessed it all. Cynthia needs the land empty for a $12 million deal and hired contractors to drag you out. My blood ran cold. Mercenaries? I reached for my phone to call the police. Maya stopped me. The sheriff won't touch a civil dispute, and by the time you file an injunction, you will be off the property, and the trust will dissolve. You cannot leave this cabin. She was right. Any movement off the property line would trigger the clause and kill the trust. I grabbed a splitting maul. Maya dragged a heavy antique chair over. Together we shoved the solid oak table against the door. We barricaded the door and nailed the windows shut until the cottage felt like a tomb. We sat by the hearth in silence. Maya's bare finger caught the firelight, no ring. She had risked everything to be here. She chose family over blood. Then the silence shattered. Headlights cut through the trees, strobing against the snow. Heavy engines rumbled nearby. Maya gripped my arm. The vehicles pulled up just past the porch. The engines idled, shaking the foundation. I heard doors slam, then the crunch of tactical boots on frozen snow. No knocking, they were here to breach. Cynthia's final offensive had arrived. The boots stopped right at the bottom of the stairs. I clutched them all, ready for the wood to splinter. Then 3 sharp, polite knocks. Megan Hall. A muffled voice called, "My name is Arthur Vance. I am here for your aunt, Cynthia's Hall, to inventory the artifacts." Mayor and I stared at each other. They didn't send muscle. They sent an appraiser. I cracked the door. A man stood there in a tailored wool coat, looking ridiculous in the Vermont wild. "Good evening," he said, flashing a slick smile. "Cynthia hired me for an urgent inventory of the antiques for a Manhattan auction." I saw it immediately. Cynthia knew an eviction would trigger criminal charges, so she sent a Trojan horse. This man was a corporate spy here to photograph my ledgers. I stood my ground. "Ethical guidelines forbid appraisals in a blizzard in the dark," I said. He chuckled. "My client is motivated," he countered. It would be a shame to report you blocked a lawful inventory. He was threatening me with a breach of contract. I pulled the door open. Arthur stepped inside, eyes darting everywhere. He studied the floor, the shelves, and my bag. "Fascinating," he murmured. He pulled out a high-resolution camera, not the tools of an appraiser. He moved toward a chest covered in a fragile 17th-century silk panel. Arthur reached out to flip the fabric. "Don't touch that," I snapped. He smirked. "I need to examine the warp," and weft, Megan. Standard procedure. My fury peaked. I stepped into his space. "If you knew anything about 17th-century silk, you would know it uses silver gilt thread on a silk core. Your hand oils will destroy it. You need nitrile gloves and proper light." Arthur Sayre's smirk faltered. "You are no appraiser," I said. "You are a corporate spy looking for a ledger. But you made a mistake. You stepped into my domain. One call to the antiquities community, and your reputation is toast. You will never work in a gallery again." Panic replaced his confidence. He knew he was talking to a professional. "Cynthia is paying me," he stuttered. "She said you were hiding family papers and told me to photograph them." "She played you," I said. "Go back empty-handed and she will dump you." "I have a deal." Arthur froze, camera shaking. I pulled Manila folder from my bag. It was filled with fake financial records. I made days ago. I had cooked the books to look like Beatrice lost her fortune right before she died. The papers made it look like the estate was bankrupt, with nothing left but the land. I shoved the fakes his way. "Tell Cynthia you found these under a floorboard during the storm. Get her the photos tonight." Arthur stared, mind racing. "Why would I help you? Because if you listen, I will act like you were never here," I promised. "You keep your pay, you keep your reputation and walk away from this family mess for good refuse, and I will ruin you by morning." He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his camera and zoomed in. He snapped photos of the fake ruin, the flash strobing through the cottage. Once done, he tucked the camera away. "I will tell her this is all I found," Arthur said. "All arrogance gone. Get out," I told him. He bolted and scrambled down the porch. His engine roared and he sped down the mountain. Maya approached the table. "That was a massive risk," she said. "What happens when Cynthia sees those photos?" I looked at the logs turning to ash. "She will believe Beatrice died with nothing. She will think the holdings are just an empty shell. She will panic, and a panicked woman," Maya realized, "makes reckless mistakes." "Exactly," I said. "Cynthia is out of time. She will drop all caution and rush that illegal sale to pay her creditors. She is walking right into the trap. We just have to wait." Day 30 broke over the mountains with blinding clarity. The storm left the forest covered in ice. I watched the last logs turn to ash. The cottage was freezing, but I barely felt it. The residency clause was met. I survived the smear, the burglary, and the spy. The trap was sprung. I grabbed the leather ledger and locked it. I shoved it into my bag next to the fake documents from Arthur. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped out. The world was dead silent. I did not look back. My work here was finished. I started down the mountain. The access road was packed hard by recent traffic. The hike took less than 30 minutes. As I hit the lower trees, the silence broke under the low thrum of machinery. Through the pines, I spotted the iron gates of the main estate. A fleet of vehicles sat in the driveway excavators, flatbed trucks, and sleek black sedans. Cynthia did not waste a second. Buying the fake photos, she assumed the estate was her only asset left and rushed to lock in the $12 million sale before her creditors caught on. I stepped out of the trees. Cynthia stood by a black Range Rover, wearing a crimson coat that screamed control. Two men in charcoal suits stood across from her with legal papers. One handed her a gold pen. Ethan stood back, shifting nervously as he glared at the idling excavators. He needed this sale to cover his gambling debts. I kept walking, my boots hitting the pavement with a steady thud. I veered onto the frozen grass. My boot crunched a dry twig. The snap sounded like a gunshot in the morning air. Cynthia froze, hand hovering over the paper. She turned slowly. When she saw me, the colour drained from her face. "Megan," she breathed, shocked, "you are supposed to be on the mountain." "I am 30 days past the will reading, Cynthia," I said, voice cutting over the engines. The residency clause is done. Ethan stepped forward, his cowardice turning to panic. You cannot be here. We are finalizing a deal. You have no standing. Before I could speak, the crunch of tires drew our eyes to the gate. A silver sedan pulled up, followed by a white van. Julian Pierce stepped out, smoothing his suit. Two men in dark windbreakers climbed out with cold professional faces. They were process servers. Julian walked straight toward the Range Rover, ignoring Ethan and stopping feet from the developers. Gentlemen, Julian announced, voice booming over the tension. I am Julian Pierce, executor of the Beatrice Hall estate. Put your pens down. The lead developer frowned. We are executing a standard title transfer. Cynthia Hall is the beneficiary. She holds the deed. Cynthia gripped the car hood, knuckles white. I have the probate papers. Mother left the estate to me. It is public record. Julian opened his briefcase. He ignored the probate papers and pulled out the crisp, watermarked paper I had seen at the diner. He laid it over Cynthia's contract. The primary will dictates property distribution, Julian explained. However, Beatrice established a blind trust, Granite Holdings, 20 years ago. The deed to this land and the structures were moved into that trust before she died. Cynthia stared at the document, eyes scanning the text, as reality hit her. The trust, she stammered. Arthur told me. The trust was empty. He showed me the records. Arthur Vance is an idiot who handled silk brocade without gloves. I snapped, moving closer. He showed you fake papers. I created just to make you panic. You believed them because you were desperate. The developer stepped away, confusion turning to fury. He pointed at Cynthia. You swore the title was clear. You signed a letter claiming full ownership. Cynthia opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She looked to Ethan. But my brother was staring at the process servers, trembling. If you sign that, Julian told the developers, you are committing fraud. Granite Holdings holds the master deed. Cynthia has zero legal power to sell a single blade of grass here. The developer snatched the closing papers away. He glared at Cynthia. You just tried to pull federal wire fraud with our capital. Our legal team will be in touch about the fees you wasted. He turned and marched to his sedan. Pack it up, he yelled. We are leaving. The machinery roared and shifted into reverse. The trucks began to file out, a chaotic retreat that left Cynthia alone. She looked at the gold pen in her hand, then dropped it. It rolled under the tire. She slumped against the car, gasping for air. Her luxury mask shattered, leaving a broken woman in a crimson coat. Ethan realized the game was up. His funding was dead, the cash needed for the syndicates gone. He turned to me, hands up in a desperate gesture. Megan, please, he begged, voice cracking. You do not get it. They have so much leverage on me. You have to help. We are family. He stepped toward me, but a figure blocked his path. It was Maya. She had followed us and watched the whole confrontation. She stood between us, posture rigid, dark eyes cold. You do not get to use that word anymore, Ethan, she snapped. She pulled a thick envelope from her pocket. She pressed it against his chest, forcing him to take it. These are your final separation papers, Maya told him. My lawyer filed them an hour ago. Keep the offshore debt. I am keeping my self-respect. Ethan stared at the envelope, his world crumbling. Maya turned and stood by me. The threat was gone. The sale stopped. The estate was secure. Julian Pierce offered me a rare, genuine nod. The residency clause is satisfied, Megan? The trust is officially active. I walked past Cynthia, who was still staring blankly at the snow. I ignored Ethan, who clung to those divorce papers like a lifeline. I marched up the stone steps to the main house. I pulled the heavy brass key from my pocket and turned the lock. The mechanism clicked. I pushed the door open, stepping inside not as the rejected niece, but as the owner of the Hall empire. I left that bitter morning behind. The foyer smelled of lemon oil and old wood, just like my childhood. This silence was different, not the quiet of being ignored, but the stillness of a vacant throne. Julian Pierce followed closely, briefcase in hand, his shoes clicking against the marble floor. We walked past the staircase and into the library. Beatrice spent her final years in this room. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held thousands of rare books. A massive rug anchored the space, centered around an antique desk. Julian set his briefcase down and unlatched it. "The time for playing defense is over," he said, pulling out a thick stack of watermarked documents. I stood near the windows overlooking the driveway. Outside, Claire and Mark looked tiny against the massive estate they had tried to steal. "You have satisfied the residency clause," Julian continued, laying the papers flat. "It is time to activate Ironwood Holdings." I walked to the desk. The documents were dense, with legal text transferring full executive authority. Julian handed me a small velvet box. Inside was a vintage 1940s fountain pen. It was a Parker Vacuumatic, its pearlescent barrel gleaming. Grandmother used this exact pen for her most critical contracts. I unscrewed the cap. The gold nib caught the morning light. I pressed the tip against the heavy parchment. Black ink flowed perfectly, tracking my signature across the final line. In one stroke, everything changed. I was no longer an outcast fighting for a drafty cottage. I was the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar trust. I held the reins of an empire. "We need a comprehensive audit," I commanded, my voice steady. "Bring me the UCC-1 filings and the asset schedules." Julian pulled a secondary folder from his case. He handed me detailed financial ledgers. I set up my base of operations at the mahogany desk. I was an appraiser. I was trained to find the truth in the microscopic details. I applied that same logic to my family history. For hours, I cross-referenced the ledger from the cottage with Julian S. legal documents. The picture that emerged was a masterpiece of financial leverage. Grandmother had not been generous. She had engineered a brilliant system of control. Every dollar she gave to Claire, Mark, and Sophie was secured by airtight pledge agreements. She owned the majority equity in Claire's brand. She held the primary liens on Mark's real estate. She possessed the voting rights for Sophie's media company. I looked at my signature, sitting beside Grandmother's red annotations. Her plan finally clicked. She did not leave me this trust just to secure my future. She could have left me cash if she wanted that. She left me Ironwood Holdings because she knew the money was poison. It had turned her own family into entitled parasites. She did not leave me wealth. She left me the legal power to discipline a broken family. I hold the voting rights to Claire's company, I noted, tracing the spreadsheet. Julian nodded. "You control the board. You can freeze her accounts immediately. And Mark's properties?" I asked, turning the page. "The liens give you priority over his creditors," Julian confirmed. "You can force the liquidation of his assets before the syndicates ever see a dime." I leaned back in the chair. The power was absolute. I could dismantle their lives with a few phone calls. "Prepare the notices," I ordered. Julian opened a portable printer he had brought. He connected it to his encrypted laptop. The machine hummed to life. Over the next hour, it churned out formal corporate documents. These were not polite requests. They were aggressive, uncompromising notices of default and asset seizure. Julian pulled the final page from the printer. He collated the stack and placed it on the desk. He reached into his briefcase for a heavy brass stamp and a stick of red wax. He melted the wax over the corner of the top document and pressed the stamp into the cooling resin. The Ironwood Holdings crest remained a stark, formal seal of authority. "The notices are ready," Julian said softly. I placed my hand on the stack. The wax was still warm. The gravity of the moment hit me. These documents were the nuclear codes I had been hiding in the cottage. They held the power to destroy my own blood. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was Sophie. She had stayed silent in Boston while the others tried to evict me. Now? The news of the blocked sale had reached her. I picked up the device. "Alice," Sophie's voice sounded frantic. The influencer persona was completely stripped away. "Claire just called me in hysterics," she said. "You stopped the sale and Julian brought out a blind trust. What is happening?" I looked at the seizure notices. "Sophie," I said, my voice cold, "check your mail tomorrow morning." I hung up before she could respond. The defensive war was over. I picked up the sealed documents ready to go on the offensive. I walked toward the library doors, the parchment secure in my grip. It was time to show them exactly what happens when you underestimate the quiet girl. Julian Pierce operated with a lethal efficiency honed over 30 years of corporate warfare. He did not use standard mail. He utilized a network of specialized process servers to ensure the delivery was legally binding and publicly undeniable. The offensive began on a Tuesday. I sat at the library desk authenticating a 17th century tapestry while the traps snapped shut across 3 states. Claire received her notice at the flagship location of her brand in Manhattan. The server walked straight into her high-profile meeting with investors. He bypassed the receptionist, walked into the glass-walled conference room, and dropped the red-sealed folder on the table. The terms were brutal. Per the pledge agreements, she had 14 days to repay over $4 million. If she failed, Ironwood Holdings would seize her inventory, trademarks, and accounts. Mark was served at a golf tournament in Connecticut. He was on the 18th green, charming regional bankers for a loan. When the server handed him the notice, it spelled out immediate liens on his properties, freezing his assets unless I gave the green light. Only Jean got hers at home. The server skipped the building concierge, heading straight to her penthouse door. It demanded immediate repayment of the emergency cash. Aunt Grandmother wired over 5 years, backed by her home equity. By Wednesday, the certified mail receipts hit my mahogany desk. A satisfying thud, the sound of total victory. They were served. The 12-week clock started ticking, and chaos erupted. No coordinated defense, just pure frantic panic as they scrambled to save themselves. Jean struck back first. Using her massive digital following, she went live from her penthouse. No makeup, just a plain grey hoodie, the classic devastated victim look. She sobbed for 20 minutes, claiming a jealous relative tricked our dying grandmother into signing away the fortune. She painted a picture of abuse and extortion, begging followers for help. She really underestimated the team in my library. Alina had just joined my operation. After handing her husband divorce papers, Alina ditched structural engineering to run PR and strategy for my firm. She watched Jean stream, stone-faced. "Time to take down this influencer," she said, her fingers blurring across her keyboard. Alina didn't argue back. She launched a precision digital strike. She used IP logs to prove the smear campaign against my business came right from Jean S. house. Then she paired that with the hidden non-disclosure agreements, the ones showing grandmother paying off designers Jean had blatantly ripped off. Alina packaged it all into a perfect digital dossier and fired it off to Jean S. corporate sponsors and every major fashion journalist. The fallout was instant. Within hours, her main cosmetic sponsor cut ties, citing a zero-tolerance policy for theft. Fashion blogs blew up, exposing the agreements. Jean went from victim to total fraud. Her followers vanished. She deleted the stream and went dark. Her career was dead by sundown. Kyle S. collapse was quieter, but just as brutal. His business was all about the appearance of cash. Once bankers saw him served on the golf course, rumors of his money troubles spread through the industry like wildfire. His partners ran an emergency audit and found the filings. They realized his investment went his own, but debt from a trust he didn't even control. They invoked the morality clauses, kicked him out of the group, and cut off all project funding. Kyle was left with unfinished buildings and zero cash. With loan sharks closing in, he was completely trapped. Only Brenda tried to fight back legally. She hired a pitbull lawyer in Manhattan to stop the clock, claiming the pledges were signed under duress and my company was a sham. Julie Tharming. He immediately filed the 3 mental health evaluations grandmother had done before starting the trust. The reports were rock solid, confirming grandmother was sharp as a tack. The judge tossed Brenda's petition, ordered her to pay the legal fees, and the 2 weeks ran out. The family went deathly silent. No more threats, no more spies. They had nothing left, shattered by the weight of the law. On the 14th night, freezing rain hammered the estate. I sat in the library, reviewing the documents to transfer their assets to me at midnight. The clock struck 11. Less than an hour left. Then a sharp buzz cut through the quiet. I looked up. The intercom at the main gate was flashing red. Julian set his pen down. Alina stopped typing. I hit the button. It was Alice. Her voice was thin, ragged, all that arrogance completely gone. Barely audible over the storm, she begged, "Please open the gate." I checked the monitor. The floodlights hit the iron gates. There they were, Brenda and Kyle, soaked to the bone and shivering in the downpour. No luxury SUVs, they come in a local taxi that was already pulling away, leaving them stranded. Yanj, no luggage, no legal folders. They had come to surrender. I clicked off the intercom, letting silence fill the room. The war had reached my door. I hit the gate release. The heavy iron groaned, and the entrance swung open. From the window, I watched them trudge up the long driveway. Rain lashed down. No umbrellas. Heads bowed. It took 10 agonizing minutes to reach the steps. I stayed at my desk. Julian stood by the fire, calm. Alina watched from the shadows. We didn't greet them. We let them walk into the hall, alone. The library doors swung open. They stepped in, dripping water onto the hardwood. A month ago, they sat here with such entitlement. Cynthia in designer silk, Mark in tailored wool. Now? Their clothes were ruined, soaked through by the storm. Cynthia gripped her bag. She shivered, and it slipped from her wet shoulder. It hit the floor with a hollow plastic thud, not the heavy, rich sound of real leather, a cheap knockoff. That cheap sound said everything, a pathetic replica, just like her, hitting rock bottom. Mark spoke first, wiping rain from his eyes. His voice was shaking, lacking its usual smooth edge. He said my name. He told me the loan sharks were hunting him. He said his partners locked him out of everything. He begged me to release the liens just long enough for a bridge loan. He pulled the sibling card, using family like a magic spell to erase the last month. He said, "Family has to protect. Family." I didn't move. I listened to the rain against the glass, thinking about the crowbar he once used to break into my cottage. I let his desperate plea hang until the silence was deafening. He flinched. Cynthia stepped forward, trying to command the room, but her teeth chattered. She claimed Grandma never meant for the inheritance to be used this way. She insisted Mother loved them, then begged me to forgive their debts. She even promised me a seat at her table in exchange for mercy. I stayed calm. I didn't need to yell. I reached across the mahogany desk and pulled the heavy leather ledger toward me. The brass lock was open. As I flipped the pages, the sharp scent of peppermint oil filled the library, cutting through the smell of damp wool. They stared, terrified of the book they knew would ruin them. I turned to Cynthia's section. I scanned her massive debts, written in black ink, then focused on the harsh red ink in the margins. I told her I was looking at finances. I was looking at her moral bankruptcy. I started reading. I read the dates. Grandma wired her emergency cash. I read the exact words Grandma used when she asked her daughter to stay for tea. I read how Cynthia claimed her driver was waiting. I looked Cynthia in the eye. That tea went cold years ago. "You don't owe $200,000, Cynthia," I said. "You owe 52 missed dinners and 100 abandoned cups of tea. And the firm is collecting." She opened her mouth to argue, but the words died. Her face turned ghost white. I turned to Mark's section. I found a note from 3 years ago. Grandma paid his gambling debts so he wouldn't get hurt. Instead of visiting her in the hospital for pneumonia that weekend, Mark bought a luxury sports car. "You don't owe a property lien, Mark," I told him. "You owe her." "The hospital visits. You skipped to play pretend." He looked at his ruined shoes. No defense, no leverage left. I slammed the ledger shut. I told them family isn't a shield for when you get caught. I pointed to Alina in the corner. I told them family is the person who actually cared while you two treated Grandma like an automated teller. You treated me like a peasant for a month. Now, pay up. Cynthia broke. It wasn't the fake crying she used to fool everyone else. It was a jagged, ugly sob. She collapsed onto her knees, shaking as tears mixed with the freezing rain on her face. She realized her manipulation tactics were useless, no charm, no guilt, just an immovable wall. She begged me not to take her brand, saying it was all she had. I felt nothing but cold resolve. I told her the firm wasn't forgiving a single cent. The 14-day deadline had passed. The takeover was active. The liens were executed. They would pay back every penny they stole. Mark made a hollow sound, realizing the road had ended. Then I pulled out a new stack of papers. I wasn't throwing them on the street to be hunted by gamblers. I had a restructuring plan. They were going to work off their debts starting tomorrow. The morning sun hit the library floor. Julian arrived at 8 with the contracts. No more begging, the storm had passed, leaving behind an unforgiving frost. Now it was just time for the math. They sat there looking small and fragile in borrowed sweaters. No designer labels, no arrogance. I didn't offer coffee. I just slid the first document toward my older brother. Mark had a talent for real estate, but he wasted it on flashy deals to impress his friends. I wasn't stripping his ability to work, just his unearned status. The firm took the titles to his properties. Julian handled the sale of his cars to pay off the dangerous gambling debts. Alina stepped up to present the divorce papers. Mark didn't argue. He picked up a pen. He signed his name, ending his marriage with a shaking hand. No alimony, no assets to pay his debt. I got him a spot on a local construction crew. He was done being a high-rise developer. Now he was a junior contractor pouring concrete in the biting cold. Most of his check went straight to the firm. He traded his suits for steel-toed boots. He would learn what $1 is actually worth. Cynthia was harder. Her whole life was a lie. I authorized the hostile takeover of her company by noon. The audit confirmed exactly what I suspected. She used cheap, exploitative factories overseas while pretending to sell organic luxury goods. I told Alina to leak the audit to the press. Her stores closed within hours. The fake empire vanished, leaving only her massive debt. I gave her one-path manual labor. I set her up in a remote cottage with a hand loom. She used to mock my work as a hobby. Now she would learn true craftsmanship. She had to weave authentic textiles from raw wool. I set a wage and kept 80% sent to pay down her debt. I drove her up the mountain in my beat-up truck. The snow was deep. She stared out the window, pale and terrified. I unlocked the isolated cabin. The loom sat in the center of the room. I gave her a manual on traditional weaving and a pile of wool. I explained her daily quotas. She touched the wood of the loom, finally realizing her new life had begun. She would spend her days in the isolation she once planned for me. I left her by the hearth and drove back down. The ledger was waiting on the desk. I touched the binding. The scent of peppermint rose up, a memory of Grandma sitting in this room. She used this book as a witness to their greed. I used it to cut the rot from our family. It was finished. I shoved the heavy ledger into the library safe, turned the dial, clicked the locks, shut. Then I pulled the old brass key out and tucked it deep inside my desk. No more hidden debts. Alina was at the drafting table, mapping out a new path. We had cut the parasites loose. Now it was time to build something real. Our firm, Granite Holdings, needed a new mission. We turned the old estate into a historical restoration center. Alina used her genius to design climate-controlled vaults in the guest wing. I used my connections to land contracts with top museums and collectors. We became the go-to experts for antique preservation. We built a real business, hiring honest, hard-working researchers and textile pros. The mansion used to reek of entitlement. Now it hummed with actual work. The war was over. We'd cleaned the wound, fixed the legacy, and set the rules. 1 year later, the mountain air felt different. The tension at the estate simply vanished. We named it the Beatrice Center for Textile Preservation. The house no longer echoed with fake boasts or designer heels. It smelled like cedar and archival paper. Alina stood in the east wing, blueprints in hand. She was overseeing a new humidity control system, blending modern glass into the original timber frame with total precision. Alina didn't just survive the divorce, she rebuilt from the ground up. Without that deadweight husband, her career soared. She was a partner now, commanding the room with total quiet authority. In the lab, our team worked on rare linens and tapestries. We were thriving, built on transparency and grit. Down in the valley, Mark was a year into his construction job. Alina got a photo of him. Mark looked rough, faded jacket, weather-beaten face, working hard. He paid his debts on time, every time. He lived in a tiny studio, broken tired, but for once actually honest. I left the house late in the day. The driveway, once a battlefield blocked by a luxury car, was now a quiet gravel road. The air had that sharp, crisp autumn bite. I carried a thermos and a small bag up the hill toward the cottage. I stopped by the tree line, watching through the window. It was warm inside. Cynthia sat there, focused on an antique oak loom. She threw the wooden shuttle, pulling the bar with a steady, rhythmic snap. Her hands weren't manicured anymore. They were rough, stained deep with dark indigo and natural dyes. Wearing a plain sweater, she caught a snag in the thread. A year ago, she would have screamed at someone to fix it. Today, she just leaned in and painstakingly rethreaded it herself. She looked exhausted, but as she checked her work, she stood taller, no more performing for an audience. She was making something real. She was paying her debt yard by yard. I walked onto the porch. I sat facing the woods, gripping my late mother's chipped mug. The scent of fresh mint and pine filled the crisp air. Everything finally aligned. The master plan was perfectly clear. Real inheritance isn't just money or deeds. Those tools are poison in the wrong hands. My grandmother knew wealth without character breeds parasites. She pushed me to the edge, forcing me to build my own strength in the shadows. I didn't win by luck. I won because I could outlast the winter. If you have ever been handed an empty envelope by your own blood, listen, being underestimated is a superpower. Build your walls and guard them. I learned 3 rules in the dark. 1, biology is not a free pass to mistreat me. 2, you can forgive without letting them back into your life. 3, your worth isn't set by people who cannot afford you. The loom clicked, measuring out honest time while the ledger stayed locked. We obsess over family photos and trust funds, thinking big houses equate to good parenting. We kill ourselves to provide for kids who just want our presence. Behind those perfect pictures, there is often a secret ledger. It is about cold comparisons and the silence of being ignored. Family sagas reveal the damage of favoritism. Love should never be a scoreboard. Neglecting a child creates invisible, lifelong scars. Children praised only for status learn that love is a transaction. Meanwhile, the child pushed aside feels worthless. Parents must own their role in a child's mental health. We have to stop ignoring the pain of the unfavored child. Every kid needs to know they truly matter. True wealth is found in integrity, not bank balances. When we fix every mistake with cash, we destroy a child's resilience. A parent's job is not to hand over an empire, but to teach them how to build their own foundation. Easy money rots a moral compass, leaving kids lost in the real world. But the biggest failure is trading presents for a paycheck. Every time a parent ignores feelings to chase status, it leaves a permanent mark on that child's soul. Don't let your connection go cold because you were busy chasing a title. Emotional fairness is what makes a child feel loved. Our story redefines kinship, focusing on loyalty over blood. Megan has 3 rules to help you move past toxic family dynamics. First, DNA does not earn the right to hurt you. Second, reconciliation requires real change, not just an apology. Forgiveness is for your own peace, not theirs. Third, define your own worth. Never let people who cannot see your value write your narrative. These rules are a blueprint for a healthier generation. We must look at our own choices and ask whose pain we ignore. If this story resonated, please subscribe and share your thoughts. We celebrate the victories of real, hard-won integrity. Look at your family tonight and see past the performance. Listen to the silences. If you had to read a ledger of your own emotional transactions, would you have the guts to face the red ink?